Okay, I'm going to try something a little bit different this time, but can I just say those last two talks were a perfect example of how knowing your risk for type 2 diabetes is actually actionable. If you all know, 23andMe released a type 2 diabetes polygenic risk score on Monday with a lot of controversies, people saying that it's not actionable, and we just saw a apparently healthy person who has type 2 diabetes and is engaging in all sorts of healthy behaviors, and an example of what he could do to improve his health even further. So what I'm going to try to do is get you to think about genetics the way I think about it in genotype first. It's a small tweak to how you think about genetics, but I think it makes a big difference. So to start with, just want to introduce this concept that we've already kind of been introduced to, is that genotype plus or genomics plus environment equals phenotype, and a sort of very rough scale. Your risk is your genetic risk plus your environmental risk, which incorporates lifestyle and behaviors and all that, and that more or less dictates your phenotype. Genomics is very good at measuring genotype, obviously. We heard about how genomics could be used to measure your environment, your exposome, and it could be used to measure your phenotype as well in some instances, like if you have cancer, for example, through circulating nucleotides. And digital medicine is sort of the complement of that, is exceptionally good at measuring phenotype and some environment. And if you combine those together, then you have individualized medicine, essentially, which is why I think it's so powerful. So what do I mean by genotype first? The way we think about genetic information in general right now is in a phenotype first approach, where generally someone will consider getting a genomic profile after there's some phenotypic trigger. Let's say a child is born with a rare disease, or you have a very strong family history of cancer, or early onset cancer, for example. That triggers genetic testing, and that's more or less a diagnosis of what is going on. If you think about things in a genotype first approach, that's how you actually get to prevention, is where you take a healthy person, look at their genome, determine what their risks are and how to best prevent those risks. To go into a little bit more detail, first from an example of where phenotype first approach works extremely well would be in rare pediatric diseases, where you have this sort of workflow. Someone either presents with a disease when they're born, or someone comes into the hospital or to the doctor with a very rare, severe condition. They get referred for genetic testing. The phenotype is actually used in the analysis to drive the prioritization, and then you come up with a diagnosis. And there's some great examples that we've worked on showing that you can use this approach to discover new genetic diseases, and the idea would be then to take these on further to treatments and cures. But this, and I should note that Stephen Kingsmore will talk a lot more about that approach, and he's really taken it to the next level. But we know this falls apart often, and Lisa Bostarash will actually talk about this. If you don't present at a physician, or the disease doesn't present early on, then you don't have a diagnosis, and you might just be walking around with a rare disease. Lisa will talk about this a lot more, where you can just take phenotypic information, identify people that have signatures for a rare disease, and actually determine that they are walking around with a rare, undiagnosed disease. The rare disease side has already really transitioned to a genotype first approach, I would say. So you have preconception and pre-implantation testing. That's essentially a genotype first approach. You're looking at what could be in terms of your child's genome, and perhaps trying to avoid that. And we saw a great example of that earlier this morning. And non-invasive prenatal testing, I would also say, is more of a genotype first approach. It's a screen to determine if there's any genomic aberrations, and then from that point on, you determine how you want to intervene. Termination was essentially brought up before, but with genomic technologies, even that is not necessarily the preferred option eventually. What I really care about the most at this point is genotype first for common diseases, and I think most of us really care about how can we prevent common diseases in a genotype first approach, and really what can we do if we had our genome at birth or early on. You have your genetic risk factors, those present first, obviously, and then the clinical factors follow. So if you had your genetic factors first, what could you do with that information for a common disease? And I'll give another example to drive that. So cancer is a common disease, and the way genomics is used in cancer is more or less, especially for cancer risk, is more or less a phenotype first approach. Let me go back. Okay, so someone presents with early onset cancer. If you are very lucky and the physician actually follows guidelines, then you should be referred for a test to determine if you had a germline predisposition, and that would lead to cascade testing in your family, which doesn't happen a lot of the times. And then, then your descendants have a chance at least to use a genotype first approach to drive, say, early screening, mammography, or that sort of thing. Or more likely, there's a trail of sort of cancer in your past, and someone eventually wises up and says, okay, maybe we should find out if there's a genetic underpinning to this and try to intervene. In a genotype first approach, we'll hear more about this tomorrow. You can determine your risk for cancer. Then you can look at different types of screening. So Jacques Simard will talk about breast cancer screening that's sort of prioritized based on your risk, and that includes genetic risk. Or Gabe Ott will also talk about screening, for example, using circulating nucleotides instead. And then that leads into the more phenotype first strategy for cancer. So to accomplish this, we've got to learn a little bit about what are the genetic underpinnings of disease? And we're really used to thinking about genetics in this fashion. And that's the fashion that comes from BRCA testing, the more traditional sort of cancer testing, where if you test positive, you're at high risk. Otherwise, you really don't get that much information. You're back to average if you test negative, because you haven't excluded much of the genetic risk. It just tells you, yes, you're positive for a very high risk factor, but you haven't excluded a lot of things, so you're either normal risk or high risk in this setting. What polygenic risks actually gets you, especially if combined with monogenic risk, is a spectrum of risk from high risk to low risk. But we generally don't think of it that way. We're still stuck thinking about just the high risk people and not necessarily the low risk people. And that's what I would really like you to think about a little bit more. So often when these genetic risk predictions come up, these are the sorts of counter arguments you see. And I just want to point out the logical fallacy that is in all these counter arguments. You usually hear something like, I'd rather tell people to stop smoking for a coronary artery disease risk, or just look in the mirror to determine what your type 2 diabetes risk is. But that's an appeal to an extreme, essentially. You're taking people who have a very strong environmental risk and saying, well, we don't need genetics because we have this. Yes, if you have a very strong environmental risk, you probably don't need to know your genetic risk information. You should probably just deal with your environmental risk. And the extension of that argument is, if everyone just offs themselves when they're 20 years old, sure, there's no heritability to any condition if your behaviors are sort of leading to death. So this is not a good argument. And even our application of polygenic risk right now is really still stuck in the phenotype first idea, I think, and I'll try to demonstrate that here. So coronary artery disease is one very interesting application area for polygenic risk. I'm not going to get into huge detail. Elizabeth Wyden after me is going to get into much more depth. But if you look at how you use genetics in coronary artery disease in a very simple way. You have 32 million people on a statin, and this is the sort of breakdown of the benefit if you just use monogenic risk factors. So these are people with familial hypercholesterolemia. They get a great benefit from being on a statin. The average person doesn't benefit much from taking a statin. All these people are taking a statin, so this person can prevent a heart attack. If you add polygenic risk to that, the picture looks like this. Now, this is the same number for monogenic risk. For high risk of polygenic risk, these people get a greater benefit from statin. The people in the middle have just average benefit from statin. And actually, these low risk individuals, low polygenic risk individuals, it looks like they get essentially no benefit from being a statin, limited to no benefit at all. And Elizabeth will go into more detail about that. But even that calculation is still stuck in a phenotype-first approach, because what are we doing? We are only looking at people with high risk, high clinical risk for disease in this situation. What we're doing is taking a clinical risk calculation, combining that with a genetic risk calculation, and then determining if their total risk sort of crosses a threshold for using a statin. So you're originally dealing with people who have high clinical risk, and then trying to use that genetic sort of lever to determine whether or not they should take a statin. That is a phenotype-first way of thinking about this, because we're not thinking about the low-risk side of things. We're only thinking about the traditional way we think of genetics, normal versus high risk. So if you think about genetics first, then you might wonder, why do these people have high risk for disease? If they don't have high genetic risk, they must have high environmental risk, assuming that you've comprehensively looked at their genetic risk and actually ruled it out. It is possible that some of these people have, say, unmeasured familial hypercholesterolemia or something like that, but probably not. They are high risk, most likely because they have high environmental risk. So actually, the conclusion is not only that these people benefit more from statins, but these people that don't benefit from a statin, they need to focus on improving their environmental risk. And that's the sort of tweak that you get from thinking about it this way. And I'll go even further to say that actually this would be a framework for using genetic information ethically. It gets back to Mike Snyder's point about personal baselines. Well, you can have an expected personal baseline that's based on your genetic risk, and your deviation from that expected personal baseline is sort of your action that has moved you away from that risk. And I'll try to illustrate the implications of that here. So usually the way we look at risk is we have a biomarker. Let's say we've measured this biomarker, say it's cholesterol, something like that. It could be any biomarker. And we have groups of people that all have the exact same measurement of that biomarker, exactly the same value. But they maybe fall into 3 groups with low risk for that biomarker, average risk for that biomarker, and high genetic risk for that biomarker. So although they have the same measurement, the implication in terms of their biomarker measurement is completely different. This would be considered a low measurement for this group. This would be considered an average measurement for this group. And this would be considered a high measurement for this group. And it is the deviation from here that allows you to isolate genetic risk from environmental risk. So, we don't want to punish people based on their genetic risk, essentially, is what it comes down to. You don't want to make decisions based on factors that are unmodifiable, and that's the fear in terms of genetics, is that you're going to be doing things that people don't have any control over. But if you actually use genetic information to determine what their sort of expected value is, that lets you actually measure environmental influence and sort of tells you, how well these people are doing relative to their personal baseline. And if you think about it that way, then if you look at how people deviate away from their genetic risk, then you can start thinking about, say, rewarding people for reducing their risk with their own actions and their own free will relative to where they should be based on their genetic expectation. So hopefully that was clear. I'm a slow thinker, so it took me a while to get to this point. But for that reason, we have started this MyGeneRank application. Some people have tried it. It's not available in all countries, generally only in the United States, but please check it out. We'll be hopefully announcing a large expansion of this program, let's say. What I'd like to do with this is actually take it into the molecular autopsy space, where we can start actually proving out the phenotype first approach, where you can start looking at individuals who have died from an early heart attack and use this MyGeneRank sort of polygenic risk score to clarify the risk in living relatives and see if they can avoid an early heart attack and death. That work is led by Elias Salfati. And if you want to learn more about our deep learning work to actually take this genetic risk prediction a lot further, Raquel Diaz will be speaking at NVIDIA and NVIDIA GTC conference in just a couple days. You already saw this as well. I just want to clarify one thing. This takes a lot of compute power to get to this point, like a tremendous amount of compute power here to get to the point where you have a pre-trained model that you can just run samples through quickly. And I'll end there. Funding, individuals who have worked on this. My contact information, you probably know what it is. If you want to see me fight with people on the internet, follow me on Twitter. Thank you.